There was some interesting work later about whether family savings behavior and investment behavior were changing. And what's interesting about this is that to the extent that families were perceiving that these transfers had some certainty about them, that they were periodic, that if they complied with some conditions, the government would in turn comply with the contract that was being made to provide the cash, so that households know that every 2 months they would get some cash. Eventually, households began to save some of the money from this. And there's some interesting papers that show that the marginal propensity to consume was about 75%, implying a marginal propensity to save of 25%. Invested after some years in some productive projects in some of these rural areas, so people began to get together and put together a little business of chickens or a little business of pigs or whatnot, and these projects have some positive rates of return. So this provides a permanent increase in consumption from the resources generated from the investment projects, separate from the increasing consumption associated with the income transfer of the program, and allows you to begin to think about a permanent change in consumption without the transfer. Third, in my view, an insufficiently noted aspect about the program has been that it serves to protect households against shocks. Because think of it this way. At the end of the day, what you had is you created a mechanism, a very flexible mechanism, by which you can reach households directly, very quickly, with an income transfer. So by now, almost 23% of all households in Mexico are in the program. That's practically the entire population in extreme poverty. And remember, in the middle of last year, there was a food crisis. So, food prices begin to go up. There's a concern about poverty. There's a temptation of, we've got to subsidize food. But because the distribution of consumption is extremely skewed in Mexico, that's extremely costly and extremely ineffective. But wow, you have a direct mechanism to transfer income to households to protect them against the shock. And very nicely, last July, the Mexican government adjusted the value of the transfer to compensate precisely for the food price shock, and therefore insulated the poor from the shock. So you have these mechanisms to protect people against exogenous shocks that you didn't have before. There have been also some work on education. There have been a lot of positive impacts on enrollment. I'll talk about whether there have been positive impacts on learning, which is a separate issue. Remember I said before that the transfers, or the education part of the transfers, were conditional upon people going to school. They were not conditional upon people's performance. So we were just trying to say, instead of having the child picking coffee in the farm, compensate for the opportunity cost of the child in the farm and put him in the school. And willy-nilly, it worked, and enrollments increased importantly, very nicely because the transfers were higher for girls than for boys. The impacts on enrollment were higher for girls than for boys, which is what we were seeking for. And very nicely, because enrollment was dropping very sharply in secondary education, most of the enrollment impacts were actually being observed in secondary education. And there were other positive indicators in schooling, progression rates, the number of children that go from 4th to 5th, from 5th to 6th to 6th to 7th, all that improved. And some of these effects were larger the longer families were in the program. So it began to give you the sense that you could accompany a generation from birth through end of high school with investments in their human capital, improving substantially vis-a-vis the previous ones. So this is more of interest to you. There were some positive impacts also on health and nutrition. There was a major increase in utilization of health services, because remember that part of the transfer is conditioned upon households going periodically to health services. So as expected, health services utilization went up. So preventive care visits increased importantly. These visits including monitoring of the nutritional status of children, and there were important increases in those indicators. And there were drops in visits for malnourished children. And as you can see here, there's sort of 1-year effects, 2-year effects. I'm not going to go through each one carefully. You know this literature better than I do, but there were positive impacts on nutrition, reductions in morbidity, reductions in mortality, and some improvements in the nutritional status for young children. So basically, the conceptual idea, which was, if you improve the supply of health services and you attract households to health services, and you package together interventions that have complementarities between them, which are better hygiene, more information for households about composition of nutrition, the nutritional supplement focused with this particular micronutrients, and additional money for people to increase their food consumption, plus better services of health, vaccinations and whatnot, preventive health, that would have a positive impact on nutrition. And then lastly, on two areas that are important, there's some work, and some of the people who have done this work, I'm not sure whether they're in this room, on the impact of changing the balance of power within the household and the composition of expenditures in the household associated with the fact that the transfer was being given to the mother, and so the relative roles and importances within the household improved. And finally, as expected and as desired, child labor participation fell, which is what you wanted, because you wanted them to go to school, but there were no negative incentive effects on adults and adults' decision, and we were very careful in the incentive design to make sure that no transfer would be conditional upon the supply of labor by the parents. So this was also measured. Okay. What has not worked? The evaluation results show so far that the impact of the program on cognitive and language ability are fairly weak. These are more recent results that are coming out of some of the evaluations, and these are results that cause us to pause and to think about what needs to be changed or what needs to be addressed. But clearly, there are weak performances on cognitive and language tests. The long-run impacts on anemia and stunting are weak. Part of this might have to do with the fact that the particular way in which the iron was being added in the nutritional supplement was not right. And I had put an asterisk before in the formula, and you learn about such technical things by now. I mean, it's such level of detail. But it turns out that the initial formula, the way the iron was being provided, could not be absorbed by people, and so they had to change it, and the initial impacts on anemia were not as strong as they were. The formula took a long time to change. It's just been changed, and now we're trying to measure now whether we're going to be having now more positive impacts on anemia. Mixed evidence on overweight and obesity, and clearly the supply side did not respond as fast as it should have responded. What has also not worked? The idea was to, from the public policy design point of view, have a single integrated program that would be the key vehicle for investments in the human capital of the poor. This has not really happened, and the political economy of phasing out other agencies gets complex. So we were able to phase out some of the agencies associated with delivering food in Mexico. There's still not. There's still some that, to my chagrin, still there, and just it was not feasible to do it. And of course, any bureaucracy will find a way of creating new spaces and new ways of living. So, that wasn't really fully achieved. Program proliferation, which is a very deep problem in bureaucracies, in federal bureaucracies, public bureaucracies, was not abated. So this was the idea of making a much more efficient use of public resources by having a single program, and not creating any government that comes in, creates a new program, adds on a new add-on, and this and that. So new programs that have been created that are really unnecessary. And most importantly, what has not worked that well is the incentives for coordination among ministries and agencies. So yes, when I did go to the cabinet and I said, I expect the education ministry and the health ministry to work together, and people said, are you nuts? They were right. An underestimated aspect of these programs has to do with issues of agency and issues of incentive design in agency. And I will come back at the end in the what next to talk about the fact that we now need to think carefully about incorporating incentives in agencies and not only in households for these programs to work. And this has not worked. So the cooperation, and this actually implies that some of the weak results that we're seeing are not really a problem of program design, but they're a problem of program operation. So you design the program and the nutritional supplement is there, and this is the protocol of health interventions, and the family has to go to the clinic, but it goes to the clinic and the food supplements sit outside the clinic and they're not delivered to the family when the family goes. and because the doctor sitting there doesn't have the right incentives to actually do it. So the design was flawed from the point of view of the agency problems. And my understanding of some of the insufficiently strong results in nutrition have to do, in my view, with issues of agency design that were not fully incorporated into the problem. Because people are consuming a lot more, they are eating more, they are healthier, they have lower morbidity, they're better altogether. But along some critical dimensions of nutrition, the results have not been so good. And I think that has to do with the nutritional supplement. Okay, so some lessons. On the positive side, I think that looking back, there were clear gains from an integrated approach. Progressa is not a nutritional program. It's also not an education program. It's not also a health program. It's also not a program to transfer income. It's an integrated program that tries to do that. And I think that it's clear now, second lesson, that incorporating incentives into programs really matters, and that the weight of the evidence says households respond to incentives. The behavior of households changes to incentives. The allocation of children time, the allocation of mothers' time, the incentive to participate or not to participate in the labor market, to go to school or not go to school. I don't have time, and I won't talk much about the importance of incorporating political economic considerations. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk a little bit about that part. And then, on the positive side, the importance of impact evaluation and the large amount of learning that has occurred from these impact evaluations. And here again I highlight the work of IFPRI. The example of the nutritional supplement and anemia is a clear example. Unless we had been doing these very careful evaluations, control treatment, trying to measure exactly what was happening to anemia, and then trying to measure what was happening to the consumption of iron, we wouldn't have detected that there were problems with the iron component of the supplement, and that the gluconate versus the, I never know the name, phosphatate or whatever, that the particular format of the iron was not being absorbed. And so evaluation was absolutely critical in detecting this problem, and many other problems that were adjusted along the way. So I take evaluation as a critical lesson. On the negative side, I think many of these programs, and here I speak beyond Mexico, have underestimated the incentive problems in agency design. Bureaucracies are strange animals, You really need to think carefully about the agency's issues of the bureaucracies. More research needs to be done on this. We need to bring in the IO guys and the guys who do agency theory, and we should invite IO guys and agency guys into the design of our programs. That's a lesson that I take. I think we underestimated also the problems of the supply side, the incentives on the supply side of health and educational services. And we clearly underestimated the importance of early child development. Back then in the early 90s, when I read the papers by some of you guys in this room, and I read some of the other papers, people working on poverty and all that stuff, my reading of early child development was not so high up there in the agenda, in the research agenda, and we did not incorporate early child development as an important component of the program, which is really a key part of investing in human capital and ensuring that these children, when they go further up. So if I were to do that again, if President Cedillo picked up the phone again and said, Levy, fix this and correct the budget, the design on the household side and the incentive side would probably be left very much the same, but I would add a component on early child development, but I would have done a different design on agency issues and on coordination issues between agencies. And I think the program would have been more potent back then. So now these programs are all over the place in many countries, and I think these lessons might be useful for other countries. As you know, in Latin America, there are many of these, and I understand and know sufficiently in other countries, like in Turkey, in Indonesia, other parts of the world are thinking about this thing. On the whole, I think evaluation results at least are less abundant as detailed as they're for Mexico, but by and large, a generous maybe reading of the literature is that there have been positive impacts on household consumption and positive impacts on human capital. But the full medium-term impacts of these programs have yet to be fully determined. We would very much love to see whether these kids who were born of mothers that received this nutritional supplement, these little infants who were never anemic, who always had a balanced diet, who always had height, measurements and anthropometric measurements along the way, who went to school 85% of the time as they were supposed to school, and whether they finish high school, whether these kids and this new generation have more human capital and can do better. And that part has yet to be measured, and we'll see that as we go down. So I'm going to skip the what next, because I don't have time. I was going to talk about a little bit about the future of the labor market, and I'm going to jump on that. So CCTs have the wrong name, but I've lost the battle to provide them with a proper name. They're mislabeled. These are income transfer programs conditional upon some socially desirable behavior. Because if we think about it, before we also had income transfer programs. It's just there were income transfer programs conditional upon behaviors that it was not evident you wanted to promote. You were transferring income through milk, but it's really not clear that you just want to promote the consumption of milk by itself. You were transferring income through subsidies to bread, or through delivery of a kilo of wheat, wheat flour. But it was not clear that's what you wanted to do. What I think the gain here is that you made explicit the investment in human capital with the income transfer, and they're an improvement over previous efforts. There's a lot of improvement of design, but my reading is that these programs are not, very important, are not going to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. And the reason is that these programs do nothing to address the major distortions that are in the labor markets of these countries. The way I think about these programs is they finish the day the youngster has his high school degree. And that's the best the program can do. Now, this guy has a high school degree and his father didn't. And he's a lot healthier than his father, and he's probably, more educated. He's in much better shape. But Progresa will do nothing to make sure that this guy gets a better job with Social Security coverage, with higher productivity, with training and all that. And this problem, in my view, is getting worse in Mexico, and it's getting worse in Latin America, and we're risking that all these investments are actually not going to occur more. So we need now to go beyond thinking about these interventions and to thinking not only about the investments in human capital of the poor, including the nutritional investments, but I think the game is now, and I'll end here, what needs to happen in the labor markets of these countries for these investments to turn into real, positive, permanent gains so that these programs can be phased out and be part of history.